Hello, everybody.
Hello.
My mom always calls this part of the day the Welch's grape juice valley of depression, because it's like can't decide whether you should go to sleep or keep going or drink coffee. So I hope this is slightly energizing for you. I'm so grateful to Joey and Jared for reaching out and inviting me here. It's been a while since I've been to Vermont, but I'm really honored to meet all of you and join you in this conversation today. I wanted to put out a couple disclaimers before I launch into my spiel. The first is that graphic design is not my forte, so please don't judge me based on my slides. I go for pictures, not text, but there's a lot of room for improvement in my life. And the other piece is that I'm about to talk about rural politics and how Democrats and progressives in general can reroute our movements in conservative red America. And so much of the work that I do is co-done with my campaign manager, Kenyon Woodward, who is also an ultra runner and had to go on a run because he's training for a race, so he's running around this lake somewhere. But his presence is here, and I want to note that because none of this could happen without him. So, okay. My name is Chloe Maxmin. I grew up in a small town called Nobleboro, Maine, 1,600 people. I was raised on my family's farm, and for as long as I can remember, I have just loved my home more than anything, and I have decided to devote my life to fighting for Maine. The biggest threat to Maine, and I think everywhere in the world, as we all agree, is climate change. So I've been working on this climate issue for a really long time, and my theory of change, the way that we think about approaching this issue, has evolved so much over the years. But this is where I am right now. In my mind, what we need to confront the climate crisis is policy. And what we need to get good policy is to elect good people and build good political movements. I think we're struggling a little bit on that front because the folks that we've been electing for years and years have not done what we need to do on the climate front. And we've obviously seen the greatest consequences of that in the 2016 election. In my mind, one of the biggest constituencies that have left behind that could be with us but are not are rural communities. So I spend my time building progressive power in rural communities to ultimately get the political change that we need at the local, state, and federal level. So I really like to articulate that theory of change because I think a lot of people who know that I work on climate are confused that I work on rural politics all the time. I don't necessarily talk about climate, but to me it's all so related and it makes so much sense. So I really like to put that out there. This link between politics and climate was not always super obvious to me. So, and I think up until recently with Sunrise and post-2016, it hasn't really been obvious to a lot of our movement. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my story and how I got there, and then I'll delve into our House race in District 88 in Maine, and we'll go from there. So, okay. I grew up on a farm, as I mentioned. We raised deer, and those are the deer. They're so beautiful. When I was 12, I got involved with this effort to stop Maine's North Woods from getting developed, and that's how I got kind of roped into activism and organizing and began to learn about climate change. I went to high school in my rural public high school, and I started this thing called the Climate Action Club because no one was talking about climate in my school or my community, but I really wanted to. So there we go. It was actually when I was in high school that I met Jared. This feels like so long ago, but that's what happened. And when we were doing this kind of work, we were really focusing on what we could do as individuals. It was empowering, like May, who talked earlier, we did the No Idling campaign, and we did reusable bags and all of this stuff, and it was good, and we started a conversation, but like looking back right now, like obviously we need way more than that. And so then after high school I went to Harvard, and when I was at Harvard I learned about the Trailbreaker pipeline, which I'm assuming all of you know about. No, okay, maybe not. So this is a brilliant plan that is now dead, thank goodness. But it was this is a picture of an existing pipeline that runs across New England. It's defunct now, but it used to carry crude oil from Portland, Maine to Canada. There's a proposal to reverse the flow and bring tar sands across Canada through New England. And in Maine, the chunk of pipeline is owned by the Portland Pipeline Company. you think, oh, that's a nice local fossil fuel company. But in fact, that company is 76% owned by ExxonMobil. So this fact blew my mind. I had no idea that the fossil fuel industry had such deep roots in Maine. And this was at the beginning of going into my second year at Harvard. So that was also the summer that Bill McKibben wrote his Do the Math thing in Rolling Stone, and divestment was really taking off. So I went back to Harvard and I started Divest Harvard. And Divest Harvard was an incredible experience. We started in 2012. The campaign is still going on today. It was organizing at Harvard that I really learned how to organize. Yeah, we'll just keep it that way. So the first thing that we did is we got all the students to vote on divestment, and 72% said, yes, that's a great idea. And the administration wouldn't engage with us, so we kept building power, and this is how I ultimately met Canyon. Canyon hates that I do this, but I've pointed him out in all of my slides so that you can see how integrated our lives are. Because this was in 2012, I believe, that these photos were taken. So the administration was like, no, climate change isn't a big enough issue to warrant divestment. And we were like, you're bonkers. So we started organizing. We did all of these huge rallies. You know, no one was talking about climate at Harvard. Nobody, except some select teachers. So, you know, we were really starting from ground zero. The administration kept ignoring us, so we escalated. We started to do civil disobedience. We blockaded our president's office building. We got 70,000 people signed on to the campaign. Someone was arrested from our group. The first time someone was arrested at Harvard since the Vietnam War protests, and the first arrest of the entire fossil fuel divestment movement. The administration still did nothing, but our movement kept building. So we fasted for 3 days. Our own students sued Harvard for their climate investments. We did a sit-in inside our president's office building. You can see Canyon holding a banner back there. And then still nothing happened, so we shut down our president's office building for 6 days and 6 nights. We had thousands of alumni coming back to campus, had so many people who were ready to get arrested that we could just hop over and shut down the other administrative building when we felt like it. But we built this massive movement. And, you know, just like hundreds and hundreds of people gathering in Harvard Yard to talk about climate change and demand that Harvard does the same thing. Another funny tidbit is that's actually not Canyon that I circled, which is a little embarrassing.
Same here.
I know, they look so similar, don't they? And then, so this was like 2 weeks before we graduated, and Harvard hired a former oil executive as our CFO, and we were all so angry. You can see our faces, we're done. So through all of this time, you know, we're learning how to organize, but we're also on the blockade, like literally as we're doing this stuff, Canyon and I are starting to get really worried, because what we see is that the fossil fuel divestment movement has been so successful at building grassroots momentum, you know, kind of like around an issue of climate change. But the theory of change of divestment was that we build a movement to stigmatize the fossil fuel industry so our politicians won't associate it with it, so that we can reclaim that political space that is supposed to be ours and now belongs to corporations. So we're getting all of this grassroots momentum, but there were no ways to pivot all of that energy towards politics. We weren't running people for office, we weren't engaging with electoral campaigns, so it was like all this power that we built was so separate from our stated goals. And that was really confusing to me. I wrote an entire thesis about it, which is what you see in front of you right there. And the day after I graduated, I moved back to Maine to think about this stuff and work on it, and worked on Bernie's campaign and a bunch of local campaigns, and went to COP21 in 2015 in Paris. And I just kept seeing our social movements be so separate from our electoral politics. So I also started to notice other patterns which kind of can be distilled into these facts. The first is that when I tried to engage with local politics, there wasn't really a good infrastructure there in Maine to do that. And so that's kind of connected to this statistic that Democrats have lost 968 legislative seats under the Obama administration. I also began to see, especially after 2016, that rural communities like mine were just getting redder and redder, and I could see no way to bring the movements that I was working on into my rural communities. I knew they would die before I ever got started, just because of language and tactics and strategies, they wouldn't translate. And I also saw that kind of thinking being mirrored by the National Democratic Party and how they talk to rural people. So, like at Harvard and organizing these progressive movements that I love and have devoted my life to, are leaving behind the kinds of communities that I grew up in, these rural red communities. So I thought, what better way to tackle this problem than to run for office? So for me, running for office and our campaign in District 88 was about meshing social movements and electoral politics. It's about building a movement that, yes, it gets somebody elected, but those are also movements that are built around issues and what's going on in our community and can hold that person accountable even after they're elected, can go to public hearings, can continue to organize. So it's like a dual purpose movement. I mean, it's just like so much better. So I wanted to introduce you to District 88, where I come from. District 88, before we ran, had a 16 percentage point Republican advantage, which is the same advantage that Republicans hold in rural communities across the country. So that's an interesting mirror. I'm trying to make the point that District 88 and everything I'm about to talk about is not random, but that there are genuine lessons to be learned from what we did that can be translated to other rural communities. District 88 has never been represented by a Democrat until me. And then it experiences so many of the challenges that rural communities, I'm sure here and all across the country, face. Lincoln County, which is most of District 88, is the most rural county in the most rural state in the country. We're also the oldest county in the oldest state in the country. Property taxes are crippling us. People don't represent us. Our voices aren't reflected in policy. It's all very, very frustrating, understandably. So I launched in February 2018. There was already another Democrat who had filed to run, so we had a primary. And we set off going, canvassing, doing house parties, canvassing in the snow, canvassing down the dirt roads. We had a bunch of local artists come together and we painted our own signs. So most of the signs that you would see driving through my district were beautiful, they were painted by really talented people. We had some of the boring ones too, but those weren't nearly as popular. We also had these dedicated canvas days, so a lot of what we did was, I told you I was going to circle his face. A lot of what we did was very intentionally separating ourselves from how the Maine State Democratic Party operates. I love the Maine State Dems. They do incredible work. I think a lot of the challenges are because of capacity and funding. So we decided to do it all ourselves. So we created all of our own universes, who I go talk to, who my volunteers go and talk to. We did that all of ourselves. We did our own mailers. We did everything by ourselves, including our own trainings for our volunteers. Almost all of the people that you see in these photos had never volunteered on a political campaign before. You can also see that a lot of them are young, and that might be odd because I live in such an old community. But it turns out that when young people run for office, all of their friends are super excited about it. So all my friends would come up to Nobleboro, and you would have super fun canvas weekends. These are some of the pictures of the trainings that we did. How many here have volunteered on a political campaign before? Yeah, how many of you had fun doing it? Okay, maybe you're a better person than I am. Whenever I've volunteered on campaigns, I've gone to like a super drab headquarter, and then I've been sent out by myself, and it's been miserable and cold, and the people have already had their doors knocked on 100 times, and I come back and I get a really bad cookie and then I leave. And it's not fun, there's no community building, and it was just not a good experience on almost every campaign I've ever worked on or volunteered on. So we thought, why can't campaigns be as exciting as social movements? Why can't we create the same kind of community with a structure like this that we did when we were organizing at college, for example? So we would have musicians come in, we would have music, we had people donate food. It was always so fun and so community-oriented, and it was beautiful. Here's just a couple more photos, including my dog. I just couldn't resist it. And I love the sign with the lights. It says, "We are glowy for Chloe." That's one of my favorites. We had over 90 letters to the editor as well. And the beautiful thing about rural communities is that we still have printed papers. So we won our primary with 80% of the vote, and that sounds like a lot. It was not that difficult because we just knocked on a lot of doors. We knocked on 10,000 doors in total in our race. But after the primary, I started talking to Republicans and independents because District 88 is only 27% Democrat. So clearly I couldn't get elected just by talking to Democrats. Have y'all used minivan before? Who has not used minivan? Okay, quite a few folks. Minivan is a tool that we use for canvassing, and basically it brings up a house, like you click on the little dot, it brings up a house, it tells you the voter, their name, their age, their gender, and their voting history. I mean, not really their voting history, but who has contacted them before. So when I started knocking on Republicans' doors, I noticed something super interesting. If you look, survey question history, that one, y'all see that? So you can see on the far left and then the second to the left, there's nothing under that. That means that a Democratic canvasser has never knocked on that person's door in their entire voting history. Isn't that crazy? I mean, why would we expect these folks to vote Democrat if we're not knocking on their door? I would also like to mention that I'm a Democrat not because I believe in party politics, but because I believe in the values of the Democratic Party. Equal access and opportunity is how I define it, and I think that the Republican narrative is very much undermining that. So I genuinely don't care in my community what party people are from. I care what values we're representing. So with that being said, the second to the right, you can see that that person hasn't been canvassed by a Democrat since 2008 when Obama was running. And then the one on the far right is somebody that's a Republican who had been canvassed by a Democrat but marked as too GOP to ever go talk to again. So all of these people, I took these screenshots because all of them committed to support our campaign. And even the one on the far right put up my last hand-painted lawn sign on her property, which was so exciting. Sorry about that. It just goes to show what happens when you talk to people who we haven't talked to in so long. Another thing that we did, which I included in this talk because I know that Vermont has pretty small and accessible districts as well, but we talked to people a lot of times to try and build real relationships instead of just something transactional. Like I hated it when I would knock on a door and someone would tell me a heartbreaking story about how they can't afford to go to the doctor, and how can I say, well, can I count on your vote? I mean, it's like too gross for me to even do. So we would make sure that we visited people multiple times. So in the primary, for example, this is my contact history with somebody who was not home. I knocked on the door 8 times, trying to see if they were there. If someone wasn't home during our general canvassing, I knocked on their door 4 times. So that's an independent who was never home. If I did talk to somebody, so this is a Republican who was home, and I talked to them twice. I made sure that I had 2 real conversations with them before Election Day. And if somebody was home, but then I went back and they weren't there, and I went back and they weren't there, and I would keep going back until I talked to them again. So I had to talk to this person, visit their house 3 more times before I had my second conversation with them. But it worked so well because these are my neighbors, they're the people that I share a community with, and now I have an actual relationship with them instead of one that's just based on voting. So we did all of this, and we won with 52.4% of the vote, which is about 219 votes. Thank you. We worked really hard. We knocked down a lot of doors. But to me, the work does not stop when you get elected. Like I was talking about how we can build these movements to keep our message and our movements going. So I spend most of my time not in Augusta, but in my community, or at least I try. So I do coffee with Chloe every month. I'm always meeting with my constituents in my community and going to events and, doing all of that kind of thing. All of the bills that I've sponsored this session were directly from conversations that I had with my constituents directly for my district. And yeah, I actually have a senior transportation bill, which seems very relevant to so much of what's been talked about today. But I think one thing that I did want to dig in a little bit deeper on is the Maine Green New Deal, which is a bill that I sponsored and that did get passed and signed into law, so that was exciting. But some people were really puzzled at why someone who just got elected in a super conservative district would sponsor a Green New Deal bill. And I had a very specific reason. I had two reasons. My first reason is that I wanted everybody to pay attention to it. I wrote the Green New Deal bill with the labor unions in Maine, and I think we all know that there hasn't been the best relationship between labor and climate when it comes to building our movements. And so I really wanted a climate bill that was rooted in rural communities like mine, and that could try and translate some of the momentum that we're feeling around climate into a more rural context. So I thought if I called the Green New Deal, everyone would pay attention to it, we could have this big conversation about what our climate movement looks like, how we're talking to each other, the people that are part of our coalitions, and we could maybe broaden our umbrella just a little bit. And that worked actually quite well. So we were the first Green New Deal legislation in the country to be endorsed by an AFL-CIO affiliate after the national one said no thank you. And you can just see some of the organizing and faces that we brought in. We also, since my background is in youth climate organizing, I made sure that the day of our public hearing was the same day as the Youth Climate Day of Action in Augusta so that young folks could come and testify and have their voices heard. And it turned into a really amazing public hearing because almost everyone who testified was from a union or was a young person. And to me, how we transition to a renewable energy economy is just as important as the fact that we actually do it. And we do not want to replicate the same injustices of climate change in this transition. So that's why we call it a just transition. And for me, that means making sure that rural voices, working class voices are prioritized in the climate conversation. So the Maine Green New Deal was passed. These are the super exciting moments when it happened. The left one is when the committee approved it, and the right one is Governor Mills signing it into law. And that was so exciting. I just wanted to add one more little piece here. So many people ask me how we won in District 88, and my answer is always very simple. It's listening and respecting what the other person is saying. I was listening this week to some of the voice memos that I took while I was canvassing. After I had a hard door or something like that, I would just talk to myself in my phone. And at the beginning of the campaign, I talk about, that I consider myself to be a very progressive person and how challenging it is to hear some of the really strong anti-climate, anti-immigrant, anti-welfare thinking that's out there. But by just simply listening and respecting the people that I was talking to, the people in my community, I discovered something really powerful, which is that we're all frustrated. I remember this one conversation I had with an older woman who was telling me how she can't afford to retire, she has to sell her home, and I remember she just got out of the shower because she had to go to work, and it was heartbreaking. And then she started telling me about how it's so unfair that immigrants coming into our country get benefits and she doesn't get the benefits that she's worked for her whole life. So that's a narrative or a logic that I don't agree with, but I can understand that frustration. I had another conversation with a couple who was very pro-life, very anti-immigrant, and very pro-Trump, and we had a very intense conversation. I was listening to this conversation, and I'm not even gonna tell you some of the things that we talked about, but in the end, we talked about these really, really, really hard, controversial issues. And in the end, I remarked that we ended our conversation by agreeing that you can be a good person and a good neighbor while disagreeing on some of these issues. And so that to me is how I approach politics these days. You know, I don't have a lot of space for hatred or extremism on either side, but I think there's so much common ground that we just haven't taken the time to uncover, because we're not knocking on those doors, because we're using the same strategies every year. We're running the same kinds of campaigns, and we're excluding the same people, and those people are just getting more and more frustrated. And how understandable is that? Because they're frustrated for the very reasons that we're frustrated, that no one is listening to our voices when it comes to climate change. So that to me is why there's so much power and opportunity in rural organizing, so much political momentum to be built, and why I'm so excited to be doing all of this work with you. So thank you again, and have a great weekend.
You folks have questions for Chloe, and Ian may beseech you to grab the other mic. Where'd it go?
Over here, Ian.
Do you folks have questions for Chloe? Thank you, Chloe, by the way. That's really an amazing story, an amazing life's work, and clearly you are not done yet. She is running for Senate. Do you folks have questions, thoughts, comments?
Thank you, Chloe. That was great. Has this inspired a whole new crop of other candidates in Maine?
Well, I mean, hard to say. I have a lot of young people reaching out to me, and just a lot of folks in general who want to run for office and want to know how to do it, and lots of people wondering about rural races as well. So I don't know if we were the cause of that directly, but I'd like to think that we kind of created an opening to have that conversation and to show that it can be done in communities that we haven't paid attention to. Like the Dems didn't even send people to help us with GOTV for the election because they think that we wouldn't win. So, you know, real grassroots movements can overcome so much of that. And I think that that's inspiring, at least to me. Yeah.
Does Maine have an emerge program as so many other states do?
Maine does have emerge. Does everyone know what emerge is? Emerge is a program that trains Democratic women to run for office, and they're in some states, but not all states. And we do have it in Maine, and I did go through emerge before I ran. Amazing. Emerge is incredible. I recommend it to every Democratic woman that I encounter.
A question off of the slide of how do you find the strength to have these difficult conversations day in and day out?
That's such a personal question. Good question. I mean, to me in this work, I spent a lot of time talking with the folks that I agree with, and I find a lot more power in talking with the folks that I don't agree with. I feel like we can't grow our movements if we're not bringing in new folks, and we can't bring in new folks if we're not going and talking to new folks. So, you know, we all have our own space and our own role and our own way of engaging with this work, and this is just the way that I feel like doing it. And it's also my home, you know, it's where I grew up. It's not a point of view or a way of living that I can turn my back on because it's what raised me. And so if I'm not willing to engage with my hometown, then I don't really know why I would live there. Yeah.
Right over here. Can you talk about Maine's instant runoff voting?
Ranked choice voting?
Yeah.
Yes, we do have ranked choice voting in Maine. I love ranked choice voting. I think we should have ranked choice voting at every level of government. I mean, to me, representing my district, I am for ranked choice voting because it gives the power for third parties to run for office way more easily. For the same reason that I support open primaries, and for districts like mine that are very, you know, have more independents than Democrats or Republicans, I think that's so important.
You might want to explain it to those here who don't know what it is.
Oh yes, does anyone not know what ranked choice voting is?
Yeah.
Okay, so ranked choice voting is yeah, like an instant runoff. So instead of having an election and then with 5 people and no one gets over 50%, and then you have a runoff a couple weeks later, When you go to the ballot, you literally rank your candidates on the ballot, and the runoff happens instantaneously. So it really encourages third parties to run for office because you have like almost an equal chance of winning. It's kind of confusing to explain, but it makes so much sense when you actually vote that way.
My question is, how do you make a living? I don't know, I'm right here.
Okay.
In Vermont, our legislators are not paid very much. It's only a 5 or 6 month job.
Yeah.
Then they have to support themselves. And it sounds as if the campaigning you did was full time for months. So how do you finance this?
Yes, that's an amazing question. One of the reasons why politics is so inaccessible to folks who really aren't retired or have independent wealth. For me, so I spent the year before I was running just working a ton and saving money so that I could work part-time while I campaigned. And I work part-time while I'm in the legislature, and then I work, I have all my other work right now too. So all together, I can do it. I'm lucky because I don't have a family. I just have to support myself. I don't really do that much. So I can work. Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, okay. My hours are flexible. My jobs are flexible. So I can work before I go to State House. I can work when I get home. And that's a privilege that I have to be able to do that with my life. But that's not accessible to everybody, which is why it's so important that like my message isn't everyone should run for office, because that's not accessible or realistic for so many folks. My message is we all gotta do what we can in the way that we can, and this is the way that I can do it. So there we go.
Chloe, one last question for you, which is just to be respectful of your and everyone's time. There's so many inspiring pieces of what you just did and what you have done, and knowing that rural Maine has a lot of similarities to rural Vermont. What sort of last advice would you give us in terms of like how we can, the best next step for those of us who want to move from caring passionately about climate to broaden our movement to bring everyone in, either in the legislative section and in the electoral arena? Your last message of advice.
I mean, the way that I approach it is I think, what would District 88 think? When you think about rural America, what would those folks say? What would somebody who voted for Trump say? What is that perspective? And how can we, it's tricky because a lot of it is very destructive, but also a lot of it is so related to what we're doing. So in the messaging that we're using, in the work that we're doing, in the campaigns that we're running, how do we make space for all of those people? And I think that there's just so many ways that can happen, from building coalitions with labor, for example, to running campaigns that have a different universe. So you're talking to Republicans instead of just Democrats. That kind of conversation, that kind of intentionality, that kind of relationship goes way beyond whatever hearing or vote or day of action we can have.
Thank you, Chloe.